Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we are making a clamp from an antique design, and stay tuned to the end. I'm actually going to be talking about a bunch of other bells and whistles you can do, and these can be very, very cool, but they are very, very quick because they just slide and anywhere they lock in place. So let's dive in and make the clamp. Let's start making this new clamp. And making clamps is a lot of fun, and it's great to make your own shop-made ones. And we're going to actually make this one with a wooden screw, which is surprisingly easy to do. First, we're actually going to start with the screw itself. And so this is a block that is a little over a foot long. Make it big enough for a handle on one side and enough thread on the other that you have the movement you want from the clamp. Usually about 4 inches more than the block you're going to screw it through. So measure the thickness of your hand, the block you're going through, and then add 4 inches on it. That's the total length of this. We're octagonalizing it. We're going to make it into an octagon, taking these squares and rounding off the corners and then finding center on this so we can take it over and turn it down. Now you can do this with a chisel and file, and I've shown several times how to do that in other videos, but I just put the rest on the lathe here, and so I wanted to take it for a spin. Quite literally. Now this is just a lot of fun to foot power this, and it is running so smoothly and so easily. I'm just going to use the roughing gouge, and for most of this I ended up just using the roughing gouge. For this it doesn't have to be smooth because we're going to be cutting it apart with the threading tool. And we're just going to use that to rough down one end to the thickness that we want to turn threads onto it. And of course you've got to have gratuitous slow motion shots. A lot of fun. Oh yeah, don't forget safety glasses. Yeah, because it is, it's kind of a power tool even on foot powering. So we're taking this from 1.5 inch octagon down to 3/4 inch. Originally I was going to have a 1 inch screw, but the 3/4 inch would fit better in the 1.5 inch thick block. That gives me enough space on both sides for the strength it needs. So we're going to rough it down close to what seems about right, and then I'm going to come in and use the parting tool to make in marks along its distance so that I know that it is at the right diameter at those spots where the parting tool comes in. So you can see putting a parting tool on the end until the calipers just slide on. The caliper's a little bit larger than it needs to be. And then it will slide on here, and I know what that point is. And I'll do like a point every 1.5 inches along this way. And then I just play the game of connect the dots. So I'll use the roughing gouge to then run back and forth. Originally I was trying the skew on this, and the skew works really well, but the skew is preferred for getting that nice final finish. The roughing gouge just goes a little bit faster, and you can also use the roughing gouge like a scraper. So it's kind of a fun multi-tool, and I tend to use it quite a bit. I'm also going to be vacuuming it all up because this is a metalworking tool, and I want to make sure I keep the wood out of all of the grease and oil on this because there is a lot of grease and oil on it. Now we'll take it over to the die set, and I have links to the tap and die that I'm using down below. You can actually buy them on Amazon or a bunch of other places. Now for the best threads, it's best to soak it in oil overnight. It's not necessary, but when you're working with oak, it tends to split out, and to soak it in there just makes it a little bit easier. And so 12 hours to 24 hours is usually enough, and you'll get this really nice clean thread with it. And we're going to run this down as far as we can, but the problem is we can't run it all the way down to the shoulder because it has this block on the end that actually guides it. So we're going to take this down until that block touches the shoulder, and then back it off. And then we can take this block off, and that will allow the cutting edge to get right down to the shoulder, and you'll be able to get a nice thread running all the way down to your handle, making a good thread all the way down to a stopped joint. We're going to flip it over and chamfer the other end, make it nice. With the octagon, I find to chamfer every other corner around into a square, and then to come back and chamfer those small corners into an octagon so you have an octagonal flat-topped pyramid. Now let's go on to the beam itself, where you need to have a vertical piece that comes off the beam that this screw goes through. And I'm making this out of this block of white oak that's a little over 1.5 inches thick. It's like 1 inch and 5/8-ish, something like that. So I'm laying out exactly how big I want it to be. I want it to stick up about 2.5, maybe 3 inches. I think I had it about 2.5 inch higher than the beam. So the block of wood needs to be the length of the beam plus however high you want it to stick above the beam. So in my case, that's a 3-inch beam, or no, I think I had a 3-inch beam, and then about 2.5 inches. So it's about 5.5 inches tall by about 2 inches wide. and then the other is 1.5 inches. We're going to cut all that out. Cross-cutting, I use my carcass saw, probably the most used saw in the shop. I use that more than any other. And then we're going to rip down the length to make it match the cut we just had with the carcass saw and take that block out of this big block. This is a large rip-cut hand saw. It is a beautiful Diston, and I have a lot of fun with it. It's one that I use quite a bit as well. I'm going to true up all the marks, square this up, make it the right shape, and then we are going to make a double tenon that then fits into this block. And there are a couple different ways of doing it, and there are many over the years. One of the demonstrations I'll show later actually used wedged tenons, and you don't want to make it right at the end. You want to actually pull it in a little bit. It makes it easier to glue everything up, and then if you want to in the future, then you can cut off that excess on the end. I like to keep that excess on the end here. So we're actually creating it's a single tenon that goes through the middle of the beam, and then there'll be the tenon from the block going on either side. So there'll be 3 tenons on the screw block going into one mortise on the beam. And it'll make sense here in a moment. So right now we're working on the beam, and this is a stick that is about 3 inches by 1 inch by however long you want your clamp to be. And the ring trick, if you haven't seen that before, I have quite a few videos on it. It makes for a really nice, quick and easy drill. And I'm making the mortise in this about 3/8 of an inch. Nothing particular. Usually you want to do it at about 1/3 of the inch, 1/3 of the thickness. So 3/8 is pretty close to 1/3 of the total thickness of the board. And for something this large, I find it a little bit faster to bore it out and then chisel the difference, though sometimes it's just faster to chisel it all out. For the final fit up, I find it much easier to use a float to clean out the inside. It hits all the high points and gets rid of any rough that's in there. You can just come in with a chisel, but a float makes it really easy just to clean that out and make it fit the way you want it to be. Now let's create the triple tenon on this, and it's not going to be a triple tenon, it's going to be more like a double bridle joint, so you can kind of think of it as that. We're going to lay it on top of the block and transfer where the mortise is and where the sides of the block are on, and then mark around the 3 sides of the end. And this will then give us the spots that we can cut down. And we're going to be cutting out 2 bridle joint spaces in between this to create 3 tenons that come down through it. And so with a tenon saw, we can cut down along the cheeks nice and clean. If you cut from one side at a 45-degree angle, then you can make sure you're only cutting on the lines you see, turn it around, and then cut the other line you can see, and you can cut it straight down and make sure you stay on your line. If you need to change things, back up, adjust your cut before you get to the depth of the cut, and kind of scratch it over to where you want it to be. Now that we've made the cuts down, we need to remove the waste in between these. And so I'll chop down with the chisel close to my line and then pop in from the end, pop this block out, and then go back in the end, chop down a little ways farther, and then pop out the next block. And it goes pretty quickly. I'll do half from one side, and then I'll flip the whole block around and do the other half on the other side. Chop in, and then pop in, and pop out, and chop in, and pop out, and eventually that's removed. Hey, that was pretty fast and easy. And then, of course, we can bring the file and float in and clean up the inside surfaces. You could do it with a chisel. The float just makes it very fast and easy, and you can also make sure that your lines connect from one side to the other so you get a nice clean joint all the way across. And so theoretically, this should just fit in there. But reality rarely goes in the way you want it. This one came in pretty close, but it was wedging out a little bit. My tenon running through the middle was actually just a hair too fat. But once it goes down in, we're good to go. I do have several live videos showing how do you actually fit these and work through all the little problems of where is it rubbing and how do you actually go about finding that out. So if you want to see those, the live videos are really where a lot of that detail stuff is. It's kind of some of these things I can't devote a whole regular video to because there's just not enough time for it. But once you work it back and forth, you get a really nice tight fit. We want this to be a very, very tight fit. The tighter the fit is, the better the chance we're actually going to get a really good glue up on this, because you're not going to be able to seriously get the clamping pressure you want on this. And that's why I have these 2 pieces on the outside, because I can clamp those. The piece on the inside, I'm not going to be able to really put much clamping pressure on that. And so in that case, it's not going to be holding quite as strong as the other. We're going to put glue all over this thing. We want it to have all the glue it needs and then some, because when we clamp it, we're going to be clamping out anything that's excess. So slide it down in, pound it all the way down into the joint you want, and then we put a hand screw clamp on this to squeeze it down in and hold it in place. Set it aside overnight, and then we can take it off and have some more fun with the next step. The next thing we're going to do is actually create the sliding end, the other end that it will clamp against. And one of the cool things about this one is it doesn't need any stops, and it can literally slide from one end to the other and lock itself down on. And so for this, we're going to make it 2.5 inches tall by about 3 or 4 inches long. There's no specific amount to it. I'm going to actually angle it a little bit because there's no reason for it to be an actual rectangle, and some of the more fancy ones put a bit of a curve in there, and you can make it however fancy you want. But in the end, it's just a block that stops the other end of the board. And so I'm going to cut down across the board and then with the grain, and I'm taking out a block just like I did before, except for it's a little bit smaller. And in this one, because it's a little smaller, I can do it all with the tenon saw rather than bringing in the big hand saw. And there is our little block, but I want to actually put an angle on this rather than having just a block on it. So I drew an angle on there. It doesn't matter what that is. It's just there for our statistics' sake. So do something that's a little bit fun. And then true it all up with a hand plane, clean it up, bring it back to your marks, and have a block that is pleasing. I'm also going to chamfer most of the corners on this because I want them to be clean and true, and then shoot up the face so that it is square to the bottom. Of course, chamfering everything because chamfers are what separate us from the animals. Now we need to make a little block that goes on the underside of this whole thing. And that little block will be what attaches the steel brace bar to, which will be the only piece of metal on this. And theoretically, you could make this all out of wood, though it would need to be a lot fatter and it would take up a lot more space on the wall. But I just decided to go with the steel because I wanted it to be. You can see how this will sandwich it. One side goes on there, one side goes underneath. But then I realized, oops, I cut it out of 3.5-inch stock when I needed to cut it out of 1-inch stock. So I need to cut a 1/2 inch off of both of these blocks. Oh well, set a marking gauge to a 1/2 inch, run around the block, and then cut it off. Yeah, everybody makes mistakes, so you learn from it, you move on, and thankfully this time I had to remove wood rather than try and add wood back on because that's always easier to do. So now that our blocks top and bottom are ready, we can then transition to the metal pieces on this. Now there is a little bit of metalworking, but I'm going to do it with all the standard hand tools, so it's a pretty simple piece. I'm going to use a strap piece of steel that is 1/2 inch by 1/8 inch, and I can buy it at the local big box store, and it works pretty well for this. So there's our blocks. Now we need to figure out, there's going to be a pin that needs to go through the steel and through the wood blocks, and we need to find out exactly what size that is. And I'm going to be using bolts for mine rather than a steel pin, so you need to test it and make sure that your bolt or your pin actually fits through it. And then you can drill these through, making sure they are nice and square through the block and the brace on top. Now this is actually kind of important to get the right angle on this. If the angle is too steep, then it won't clamp down. And if it's too lax and too laid back, then there's a lot of movement in it, and it tends to flex around and not be as useful. So I'm going to set up the angle exactly where it needs to be on a bevel gauge, and then figure out how long my my steel pieces need to be. So I measure the distance from hole to hole, and then make it a little bit longer so I can drill the hole in it. Cut one with a hacksaw, use it to mark the length of the second one, and then cut that one with a hacksaw. Now we need to drill 2 holes in the ends of these, and it is easier to drill them together. I'm using the calipers that I used to measure the distance that the holes were apart to actually mark them on this. I know, marking with calipers, not the best thing to do. Oh well, grow up. It's fine. It really isn't an issue at all. So I'm going to be boring through one into the other, and drilling a hole that will fit the screw through, that goes through the steel and into the block, and then clamp them together and drill a hole on the other side. Make sure that the angle is what we want, and good, we're good to go. So we're going to run a screw through the steel, through the block, and then put a nut on the other side. I'm going to round over all the corners and soften this because I don't want any rough edge from the steel, and then to I guess I could paint the steel for corrosion, but I'm just going to oil it up and be good with that. The one last thing it needs is a bit of sandpaper on the bottom piece, and that is the one thing that adds friction to this whole item. We need to have friction on that bottom block. I guess we'll get to that here in a moment. We're back on the main block, and we had to start putting the threads through to put the screw in. Yeah, that thing that we made a while ago. So when we drill the hole for this, we need to make sure that the hole is the appropriate size. We want it to be the right diameter to fit the tap we have. Yeah, here's the block. We're going to add it with just a little bit of Super 77 fast adhesive. Nothing special, because if it ever comes off, we can always pull it off and put a new one on. So then we can tap the hole, and you want to run the tap in a little ways until the thread starts to clog up, and then back it out, clean it out, and run a little ways, and then back it out, clean it out. It takes about 3 times to get all the way through this block. And then back to this once the glue has set, clean it off smooth, and so we now have sandpaper attached to the bottom piece on that. And from this point on, it's basically done. We're just going to do a bunch of fit and finish on this. I'm going to chamfer off all of the edges, plane off any of the end grains and other things like that. Glue squeeze out. I actually like to chisel it off rather than to clean it up ahead of time. It's amazing what you can do with a card scraper and a chisel, and it's a lot of fun to do that way. I was playing with using a double screw on there, and originally I put washers on to separate the steel away from the wood. I found out that wasn't better. I ended up taking the washers off and putting the steel smack on to the clamp itself.
Let's try it the right way.
And so at this point, it's just put it all together. Bolt goes through the steel, through the wooden block, put those on the top, tighten them down, and I ended up putting lock nuts on them eventually once I found it to work in the way I want it to go. And that's the clamp. Run the screw in, make sure there's some oil on there, and this one was a little bit tight, but with some oil and it will clean up, and they kind of work together and eventually start to be the really nice fit you're looking for. I'm going to finish this all up with boiled linseed oil and paste wax, and that's the clamp. You can make this a lot more fancy, and I'll talk about that here in a minute, but it's a pretty simple, easy project, and this clamp will do pretty much anything you need a regular beam clamp to do. That's a lot more pressure than you need for tight bond. Almost 300. Let's see if I can get over 300. There you go. 315. And one of the new shop-made ones is a bigger handle. Look at that. So there's a bit of a history on this. This one I found at an MWTCA meet. A friend of mine came up to me and said, hey, I just found this, and this is kind of cool. I wanted to see how this actually works, because it's just a little bit of sandpaper underneath, and with the right force, this just doesn't come apart. I mean, I can put all the force on this I want, and it is perfectly there. And so all I have to do to move it is just move it back, and now I can slide it to any spot I want and immediately clamp down at that spot. So it's really kind of a cool system. And it's very simple to make, and so I thought I would make one. Now, I wanted to duplicate the original, and so I did a lot of the exact same thing. It's just a screw coming through that connects onto it. And a lot of old vices, they just had the screw coming through, and that was your connection point. And then the other end is just a simple slider. And the angle on this pretty much is required. It has to be that angle. But everything else on this, you can make it whatever size you want. Now, the original one was a lot smaller. It was about 1 inch thick by about 2 inches tall, whereas mine is 3 inches tall by 1 inch thick and all out of oak. And so I made my stop a little bit thicker, whereas theirs was originally the same size, but they put some slats on the outside to separate it and make it a little bigger. But when he gave me this one to look at, he also provided me with a couple others that he's made a bunch of other updates to it. So if you like this design and you'd like to make it a little bit better, here's some other ideas that would help you with that. So on this one, you can see the double tenon system here, and he actually wedged them. And then rather than leaving this long, he cut it off flush. So there's a very thin amount here, but you really don't need that. Really nice, simple design here. Then he also thought, you know, rather than having the screw on this side, we're going to move the screw over to this side. And that has a couple interesting functions to it, making it pretty easy to set up and just have everything on one side. So I can line this on the other side of the panel and then slide this up to where I need it and clamp it down. Also, you'll see this little rotating head on here so that you have a standard pad on there. That's just done by having a hole in the back of this dowel, and then you put a screw through, and the screw is recessed into this face so the screw doesn't touch, but the screw also spins. Really simple little system to add on it. But you can even take this a step farther. This one he made, and this is kind of like the granddaddy of them all. This has all the bells and whistles. It has this little spacer here and a spacer on this end, so when you set it on a bench, this still has space underneath and can slide rather than it teeter-tottering on that. Also, he put a stop on this. Rather than just having that one disc stop, you've got a large face, so it's almost a parallel clamp. To do that, he actually cut a groove in here, and then there is a finger that fits down into it, so this doesn't rotate. So you have this large flat surface that actually holds pretty close to parallel. A fairly simple design, and again, you can see the screw recessed inside there that rotates when you rotate the handle. So the screw is spinning freely, but then the back of the wooden screw is pushing on this plate. A really cool design and a lot of fun with extra bells and whistles along the way. So I hope you like that little bit of history, throwing this together and showing some of these. This is a really ingenious little design that I've never seen before, just to have that emery board, the sandpaper on the bottom to keep it from sliding. And it works really, really well. So I'm actually going to be doing a few tests on these and seeing how much force I can put on them. And so if you see that, the video will be coming up soon, or we'll see how that goes. But I hope you like this. If you have any other ideas of something I could do to make these even better or improve on some of these other designs that have come out, let me know. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of beam clamp designs out there. So this is just one more to have a little bit of fun. And if you'd like to see other beam clamp videos, I've got a whole pile of others. It's something that, yeah, you get addicted to, because at some point there's always a project where you need at least one more. You never have enough of these stupid things. So I hope you like this. If you do have any other thoughts, comments, snide remarks, let me know. Also want to say a huge thank you to all the patrons on Patreon, everyone who's scrolling over the side. Without you guys, this channel wouldn't exist, so thank you for that. I say it every week, but without the support of patrons on Patreon, we wouldn't be here. The lights wouldn't be on, and this channel wouldn't be existing. So thank you. If you also like to help out, you can help out by clicking the join button or hitting like, share, subscribe. Those things really do work as well. So I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Ow, 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 ow. Oh, ow, that was hard. My wood is cramping.